In the summer of 1876, a single wooden riverboat shattered every speed record on the Missouri River system, covering 710 miles in just 54 hours. Captain Grant Marsh wasn't racing for a trophy or a purse of gold. He was pushing his engines to the point of explosion to save the lives of 50 shattered, bleeding men from a battlefield that shouldn't have existed. This is the story of the Far West and the most desperate race in the history of the American West. To understand how a riverboat became a lifeline, we have to look at the scorched plains of the Montana Territory in 1876. The United States was at war with a massive coalition of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. General Alfred Terry and the famous George Armstrong Custer were leading a campaign into a wilderness where roads didn't exist. In this rugged terrain, the only way to move massive amounts of supplies was by water. But the Yellowstone River was a nightmare of shifting sand and hidden currents. The Army needed a vessel that could practically walk on water, and they needed a captain with enough grit to navigate a winding death trap. They found both in Grant Marsh and his shallow draft sternwheeler. But as the troops marched away from the riverbanks and into the hills, no one realized that the water would soon be the only thing standing between dozens of men and a shallow grave. Grant Marsh was not a man who feared the water. By the time the centennial summer arrived, he was already a living legend among the rivermen of the frontier, a veteran who had spent decades decoding the moods of the Missouri. He knew the water the way a farmer knows the soil of his own fields. He could spot a tiny ripple on the surface and know instantly if a deadly submerged tree trunk was waiting just inches below to tear the hull of his boat wide open. He understood the shifting sandbars, the sudden drops in depth, and the violent currents that could smash a vessel to splinters in a heartbeat. Marsh was the undisputed master of this dangerous domain, and his steamboat, the Far West, was a perfect extension of his will. The vessel was a shallow-draft stern-wheel packet boat, specifically designed to navigate the incredibly thin waters of the upper Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. She was an engineering marvel, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo while drawing only 20 inches of water when fully loaded. Other rivermen used to joke that a boat like the Far West could float on a heavy dew, but Marsh knew better. Even with her shallow draft, the rivers of the Montana Territory were notoriously unforgiving. The water levels fluctuated wildly, dropping suddenly and leaving boats hopelessly stranded on massive, hidden sandbars. To combat this, the Far West was equipped with a unique, highly specialized piece of equipment known as grasshopper spars. These were two massive, heavy wooden poles rigged to the bow of the vessel with a complex system of blocks, tackles, and steam-powered winches. If the boat ran hard aground on a sandbar, the crew could lower these giant wooden legs into the riverbed, angle them forward, and use the steam engine to literally lift the front of the boat out of the water and drag it forward a few feet at a time. It looked exactly like a giant mechanical grasshopper crawling over the sand. It was a brutal, exhausting, and incredibly slow process, but it was often the only way to free a trapped steamboat from a muddy grave. Marsh knew every inch of this vessel, from the massive high-pressure boilers on the main deck to the ornate pilot house perched high above. He knew her limits, and more importantly, he knew how to push her just past them. As the summer sun beat down on the muddy waters, Marsh and the Far West were about to be tested in ways no riverman had ever imagined. The Army had chartered his vessel to serve as the floating supply base for their massive campaign against the Native American tribes. Marsh accepted the job, confident in his boat and his crew. He had no way of knowing that within a matter of weeks, his sturdy cargo vessel would be transformed into a nightmare ship of agony and blood. This was the calm before a storm that would change the frontier forever. The campaign began with an air of absolute confidence. General Alfred Terry and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had formulated a sweeping strategy to encircle the Native American encampments. The Far West was tasked with ferrying supplies up the Yellowstone River, pushing as far upstream as the water would allow to establish a base of operations. In late June, the steamboat reached the mouth of the Bighorn River, a remote and desolate spot deep in hostile territory. Here, Marsh tied up the boat and waited. The army columns, including Custer's legendary 7th Cavalry, marched out into the rolling, dusty hills, disappearing into the vastness of the plains. The crew of the Far West settled into a tense, uneasy routine. The air was thick with heat and the ever-present buzzing of mosquitoes. The silence of the wilderness was oppressive, heavy with unspoken anticipation. Days dragged on, turning into a week of agonizing waiting. Then, the silence was shattered. It started as a trickle of horrifying rumors brought in by indigenous scouts. Stories of a massive battle, of overwhelming numbers, and of a total massacre. Marsh and his crew refused to believe it. Custer was considered invincible, his regiment the pride of the army. But the horrific truth soon staggered out of the brush. On the morning of June 30th, a heavily armed detachment of soldiers arrived at the riverbank, their faces grim and their uniforms caked in dust and dried blood. They brought with them a staggering, unbelievable report. Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his entire immediate command had been wiped out at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Over 200 men were dead, left mutilated on a dusty ridge. But the tragedy didn't end there. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen had survived the onslaught, pinned down for days on a nearby bluff, and they had dozens of severely wounded men in desperate need of medical attention. If you are fascinated by these forgotten moments of incredible frontier survival and want to see more deep dives into the hidden corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a documentary. Captain Marsh watched in stunned horror as the first of the wounded were brought aboard the Far West. Men were missing limbs, suffering from horrific gunshot wounds, their bodies shattered by arrows and clubs. The pristine decks of the steamboat were instantly stained crimson. The moans of the dying replaced the rhythmic chugging of the steam engines. The Army surgeons, overwhelmed and lacking adequate supplies, turned to Marsh with a desperate, impossible plea. These 50 wounded men needed a proper hospital, and the nearest one was at Fort Abraham Lincoln in Bismarck, Dakota Territory. That was 710 miles away, down a twisting, treacherous, completely untamed river system. The surgeons told Marsh that if these men didn't reach Bismarck quickly, almost all of them would die of infection or shock. The mission was clear, but the execution seemed like sheer suicide. Marsh looked at the bleeding soldiers covering his deck, then looked at the muddy, unpredictable waters of the Yellowstone. The clock was ticking, and every single second mattered. He had to make a choice that would define his legacy. The transformation of the Far West from a rugged frontier supply vessel into a floating military hospital was a frantic, desperate affair that blurred the lines between engineering and emergency surgery. Captain Marsh's voice rasped with urgency as he ordered his crew to strip the boat of every ounce of unnecessary cargo. Men heaved heavy crates of salt pork and barrels of flour over the side, the splashing thuds echoing against the canyon walls as the boat rose inch by inch in the water. They needed speed, and they needed to glide over the shallowest, most treacherous sandbars without a second of hesitation. The main deck was cleared of its industrial clutter to make way for the broken, mud-caked bodies of the 7th Cavalry. The crew gathered huge mounds of freshly cut prairie grass, the wild blue stem still sweet-smelling and supple, spreading it thickly across the sun-bleached wooden planks to create a makeshift, shock-absorbing mattress. Over this coarse, springy bedding, they stretched out heavy canvas tarpaulins. The fabric was stiff and smelled of oil, but it was the only thing standing between the men and the splintered floorboards, and it soon began to darken as it soaked up the appalling amounts of blood that were already beginning to pool in the low spots of the deck. As the wounded were carefully carried aboard on tattered blankets and stretchers, the sheer scale of the horror became undeniable. 50 men, many of them in the throes of agonizing pain and delirious with a rising fever, were laid out side by side in cramped rows. The stench of salt sweat, burnt black powder, and the sickly sweet rot of gangrenous wounds filled the humid summer air. The heat was absolutely suffocating, baking the wooden decks until they were hot to the touch and turning the lower levels of the steamboat into a stifling, windowless oven. The Army surgeon, Dr. Henry Porter, was the only medical officer left alive to tend to the massive number of casualties. He moved frantically from man to man, his wire-rimmed spectacles constantly fogging in the humid heat as he wiped gore from his hands onto an apron already stiff with dried plasma. With rudimentary tools and a grim set to his jaw, he amputated shattered limbs and probed for lead slugs. He bandaged gaping holes with strips of torn linen and dispensed meager rations of morphine to quiet the most agonizing screams. But Porter knew in his heart that his efforts were only buying these men a few more hours of life. Down in the engine room, the engineers were facing their own logistical nightmare. A steamboat like the Far West was a voracious, fire-breathing beast that consumed massive quantities of fuel to stay alive. To maintain the high steam pressure required for maximum speed against the current, the boilers needed a constant, rhythmic supply of dry cordwood. Marsh knew they didn't have the luxury of time to stop at the usual wood yards. Every hour spent cutting timber was an hour that infection spread deeper through the bodies of the men groaning on the deck above. The crew frantically loaded every single piece of cut wood they could find, stacking it dangerously high around the boilers until the space felt like a wooden tomb. They needed enough fuel to push the engines to their absolute breaking point, generating the massive horsepower required to fight the swirling currents. Among the vibrating machinery, the head engineer noticed a hairline fracture beginning to spiderweb across the secondary steam pipe, a silent plant that he chose to ignore, knowing that a single surge in pressure could turn the entire deck into a scalded graveyard. The engineers stared at the towering piles of wood, knowing that even this massive stockpile might not be enough to feed the roaring furnaces for the entire journey. They were preparing to run the engines hotter and harder than the manufacturer had ever intended, pushing the iron boilers to pressures that bordered on explosive. The entire boat vibrated with a nervous, terrifying energy that rattled the teeth of everyone on board. Captain Marsh stood in the pilot house, his weathered hands gripping a large wooden wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes scanned the coffee-colored water for the telltale ripples of hidden snags. The lines were cast off with a heavy splash. The massive stern wheel began to churn the muddy water into a white froth, and the far west swung out into the main channel of the Yellowstone River. The desperate race against death had officially begun, and the river was already pushing back with a heavy, relentless surge. As the far west surged down the Yellowstone, an unspoken, profound bond began to form between the hardened riverboat crew and the shattered soldiers lying on the deck. These were men from entirely different worlds. The deckhands were rough, calloused rivermen, accustomed to the brutal life of the frontier waterways. The soldiers were a mix of seasoned veterans and young recruits, broken by the unimaginable horrors they had witnessed on the dusty ridges above the Little Bighorn. Yet, in the suffocating heat of that floating hospital, those differences vanished entirely. The crew members, when they weren't frantically feeding the roaring furnaces or manning the rigging, stepped in to act as makeshift nurses. They brought cups of muddy river water to parched lips, wiped sweat-drenched foreheads with torn rags, and sat quietly beside dying men, offering what little comfort they could. Captain Grant Marsh found himself deeply moved by the quiet suffering of his passengers. He frequently stepped down from the pilot house, leaving the wheel in the hands of his trusted steersman to walk among the wounded. He spoke in low, reassuring tones, promising the men that he would not stop, that he would push the boat until her timbers shattered if it meant getting them to safety. Marsh forged a particularly strong alliance with Dr. Henry Porter. The young surgeon was operating on pure adrenaline, his uniform stained dark with the blood of his comrades. Porter confided in Marsh, explaining the grim reality of their situation. He pointed out the men who were fading fastest, the ones whose wounds were already showing the deadly signs of infection. Porter made it agonizingly clear that mere days stood between life and death for the majority of the men on the deck. This stark medical reality fueled Marsh's determination. Every groan from the deck below felt like a personal failure, a reminder that they were not moving fast enough. The captain pushed his engineers to open the throttles wider, forcing more steam into the massive cylinders that drove the stern wheel. The boat shuddered violently with every rotation, the wooden hull vibrating under the immense strain. The rhythmic thrashing of the paddle wheel became a heartbeat, a mechanical pulse of hope driving them forward. But the Yellowstone River was not a willing participant in this rescue mission. It was a wild, untamed beast, full of hidden currents and deadly obstacles. The water level was dropping steadily as the intense summer heat evaporated the river, exposing jagged rocks and massive submerged trees that had been swept away in spring floods. Navigating these waters required absolute concentration and an almost supernatural ability to read the surface of the river. Marsh spent agonizing hours staring at the swirling water, his eyes burning from the glare of the sun, constantly spinning the massive wheel to dodge invisible death traps. He knew that a single mistake would tear the bottom out of the far west and send everyone aboard to a watery grave. The burden of command weighed heavily on his shoulders, a crushing pressure that only intensified as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant, bloody hues of orange and red. Marsh paused by a young man named William Henderson, whose tattered Union blue jacket was soaked through with blood from a shoulder wound. The boy clutched a crude driftwood splint, his eyes glazed with a fever that Marsh knew all too well. The darkness was coming, and with it, a whole new set of terrors. The brilliant sunset slowly gave way to the creeping shadows of twilight, and with the fading light came a terrifying new reality for everyone aboard. In the golden era of steamboating, Navigating a shallow, obstacle-filled waterway like the Yellowstone River was strictly a daytime endeavor. When the sun went down, the shadows played tricks on the water, making it absolutely impossible to read the subtle ripples and breaks that indicated a submerged snag or a hidden sandbar. The standard ironclad rule of the river was simple. When darkness falls, you tie the boat to the bank and wait for the morning light. To run blindly into the pitch-black night was considered an act of sheer lunacy, a guaranteed death sentence for the vessel and everyone aboard. As the sky darkened to a deep, bruised purple, the crew of the Far West instinctively began to prepare the heavy mooring lines. The engineers started to dial back the steam pressure, expecting the familiar ring of the telegraph bell ordering them to halt the engines. Down on the main deck, the wounded soldiers felt the vibration of the engines begin to slow, and a wave of despair washed over them. They knew what a delay meant. Every hour spent tied to the muddy bank was an hour that gangrene could spread, an hour that a slow internal bleed could turn fatal. The groans of the men seemed to grow louder in the cooling evening air, a haunting chorus of pain that drifted up to the pilot house. Captain Grant Marsh stood at the massive wooden wheel, staring out into the gathering gloom. The river ahead was transforming into a black, impenetrable ribbon, devoid of any defining features. The towering cottonwood trees on the banks became looming, monstrous silhouettes. The safe, logical choice was obvious. He had to stop. The risk of tearing the hull open on a hidden snag was astronomically high. If the boat sank here, in the middle of hostile territory, hundreds of miles from help, the wounded would drown in their makeshift beds, and the uninjured would be stranded. The responsibility for the vessel and the lives of the crew rested entirely in his hands. He could feel the eyes of his officers on him, waiting for the order to drop the heavy wooden gangplanks and secure the boat to a sturdy tree. The silence in the pilot house was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, slowing chug of his smokestacks and the distant, agonizing cries from the deck below. The river was dropping faster now, the water level visibly receding as the summer drought tightened its grip on the Montana territory. Every inch of water lost meant the hidden dangers beneath the surface grew closer to the fragile wooden hull. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from a desperate rescue mission into a nightmare of impossible choices. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped around the steamboat, hiding the deadly traps that lay just ahead in the rushing current. Marsh wiped the cool sweat from his forehead. He had navigated treacherous waters for decades, but he had never faced a river this low, in pitch darkness, with 50 lives hanging in the balance. The river whispered its threats against the wooden hull, mocking the fragile vessel and the man who dared to challenge it. He knew that the next few minutes would decide the fate of every soul on board, and the cost of caution was becoming more than he could bear to pay. Captain Grant Marsh gripped the spokes of the large wooden wheel until his knuckles turned completely white. He looked down at the deck, unable to see the men in the darkness, but feeling their presence, hearing their labored, ragged breathing over the sound of the idling engines. He thought of Dr. Porter, exhausted and covered in blood, fighting a losing battle against time and infection. He thought of the widows and orphans that would be created if these soldiers didn't make it back to civilization. The rules of the river were written in the wreckage of 1,000 sunken steamboats, and they all screamed at him to stop. But Marsh knew that tonight, the rules had to be broken. If he tied up, men would be dead by sunrise. It was a brutal, terrifying calculus. Risk the entire boat and everyone on it for a chance at salvation, or play it safe and guarantee the slow, agonizing death of the soldiers entrusted to his care. Slowly, deliberately, Marsh reached out and grasped the brass handle of the engine room telegraph. He didn't pull it back to signal a stop. Instead, he shoved it forward, ringing the bell loudly in the sweltering engine room below, signaling for full steam ahead. Down below, the engineers stared at the brass dial in absolute disbelief. Full ahead? In the pitch black? On a dropping river? It was madness. But they were rivermen, and they followed the captain's orders. They threw open the firebox doors, the blinding orange light illuminating their sweat-drenched faces, and began hurling massive logs into the roaring flames. The boilers hissed and groaned as the pressure gauges spiked dangerously high. The massive pistons began to pump with renewed, violent fury, and the great wooden stern wheel bit hard into the black water, churning up a massive wake of white foam. The far west surged forward into the impenetrable darkness. It was the point of absolutely no return. There was no backing down now, no changing his mind. Marsh had committed them to a suicide run through the black heart of the wilderness. He ordered his best men to the absolute front of the bow, armed with long wooden sounding poles to constantly measure the depth of the water, though he knew by the time they shouted a warning, it might already be too late. He relied on pure, unfiltered instinct, steering by the faint, starlit silhouettes of the treetops and the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the sound of the water rushing past the hull. The boat was flying down the river, pushed by the current and the massive steam engines, traveling at a terrifying, unprecedented speed. Every sudden jolt, every scrape of a submerged branch against the bottom of the boat sent a jolt of pure terror through the crew. They were riding a wooden missile through a minefield, blindfolded, with 50 dying men strapped to the nose. The darkness swallowed them whole, the roar of the engines echoing off the canyon walls as Captain Marsh stared into the void, praying that his instincts would be enough to keep the devil at bay for one more night. The tension aboard was palpable, a thick, suffocating dread that mirrored the oppressive summer heat. Even the wounded men on the deck fell silent, sensing the terrifying shift in momentum. They were no longer just passengers on a hospital ship. They were participants in the most dangerous, reckless gamble in the history of Western river navigation. The terrifying reality of navigating the Yellowstone at night quickly made itself known. The river was a chaotic maze of twisting channels, blind corners, and deadly submerged forests. Without the sun to illuminate the water's surface, the massive, waterlogged tree trunks hidden just beneath the muddy currents became invisible torpedoes. The far west was moving at an incredible, reckless speed, the current pushing them relentlessly downstream while the paddle wheel drove them even faster. Suddenly, a sickening, violent shudder ripped through the entire vessel. The sound of splintering wood echoed over the roar of the engines as a massive, unseen snag scraped violently along the starboard hull. The impact threw men to the deck and caused the wounded soldiers to cry out in fresh agony as they were violently jostled in their makeshift beds. Down in the dark, cramped hull, the carpenter frantically inspected the damage by the flickering light of a lantern. The thick wooden planks were deeply gouged, groaning under the immense pressure of the rushing water. But miraculously, they held. The hull had not been breached. It was a terrifyingly close call, a stark warning from the river that their luck could run out at any given second. But Marsh couldn't slow down. He knew that reducing speed meant losing maneuverability in the fast-moving current, making them even more susceptible to being swept sideways into a deadly obstacle. He had to maintain momentum. He shouted down the speaking tube to the engine room, demanding even more power, even more steam. The engineers were already pushing the massive iron boilers far beyond their safe operating limits. The pressure gauges were vibrating wildly in the red zone, indicating that the riveted iron plates were under catastrophic strain. This presented Captain Marsh with an agonizing moral dilemma. If he continued to demand this level of extreme pressure, the boilers could rupture.
A boiler explosion on a wooden steamboat was a spectacularly violent event. A catastrophic blast of superheated steam and shrapnel that would instantly vaporize the engine room, blow the vessel to matchwood, and scald everyone on board to death. It was the absolute worst way to die on the river. But if he ordered the engineers to vent the steam and reduce pressure, the boat would slow down. The journey would stretch out for days, and the soldiers bleeding on the deck would inevitably perish from infection. He was forced to weigh the immediate, catastrophic risk of blowing his own crew to pieces against the slow, agonizing certainty of the soldiers' deaths. He stood in the dark pilot house, listening to the terrifying, high-pitched scream of the overtaxed boilers, feeling the intense heat radiating up through the floorboards. He chose the risk. He chose speed. He trusted his engineers to walk the razor's edge of disaster, keeping the fire roaring just below the point of total annihilation. The Far West hurtled onward, a floating powder keg tearing through the black wilderness, driven by a desperate captain who had decided that if they were going to go down, they were going to go down fighting. Every screech of metal, every groan of the overstressed wooden beams was a terrifying reminder of the gamble he was taking. The firemen, stripped to the waist and slick with sweat, shoveled coal and wood into the roaring maws of the furnaces, their faces illuminated by the hellish orange glow, knowing that each scoop brought them closer to either salvation or a fiery, explosive death. Just as the first faint gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, disaster struck with brutal, unapologetic force. The Far West was navigating a particularly wide, deceptively calm stretch of the Yellowstone River. The water looked smooth, but that smoothness was a lie. The river had spread out over a massive, hidden plateau of compacted mud and sand, drastically reducing the water depth. Before the men on the bow could even shout a desperate warning, the steamboat slammed violently into the submerged sandbar. The impact was horrific. The massive vessel lurched forward, throwing crewmen off their feet and sending medical supplies crashing to the deck. The great stern wheel spun wildly in the air, churning nothing but muddy froth as the entire front half of the boat rode up onto the solid sandbank. The Far West ground to a sickening, shuddering halt. The silence that followed the crash was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the renewed groans of the wounded soldiers. They were stuck, hard aground, and not just lightly brushed against a sandbar, but driven deep into the mud by their incredible speed. The engineers frantically threw the engines into reverse,
the paddle wheel churning the water in a desperate attempt to pull the boat backward. But it was entirely useless. The hull was wedged firmly onto the river bottom, held fast by thousands of pounds of pressure. Captain Marsh rushed out onto the deck, staring at the muddy water swirling around the trapped bow. They were miles from the main channel, stranded in the middle of nowhere. The sun was beginning to rise, bringing with it the promise of another day of sweltering, unbearable heat. Down on the main deck, Dr. Porter looked up at Marsh, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. The sudden stop had jostled his patience terribly, reopening wounds and causing fresh bleeding. The clock, which had been ticking so loudly in Marsh's head, now sounded like a deafening hammer. Every minute they sat immobilized on this sandbar was a death sentence for the men slowly bleeding out below. It was the absolute lowest point of the journey. The incredible speed, the terrifying night run, the risks they had taken, it all seemed entirely for nothing. They were paralyzed in the wilderness. Marsh knew that waiting for the river to rise was not an option. Waiting meant death. He had to get this massive wooden boat off the sandbar, and he had to do it immediately, using nothing but the sheer muscle of his crew and the mechanical ingenuity of the vessel itself. The crew looked to their captain, their faces painted with a mixture of exhaustion and creeping panic. The muddy waters of the Yellowstone mocked their predicament, swirling lazily past the trapped hull as if completely indifferent to the agonizing drama unfolding on the wooden decks above. They were trapped in a graveyard of their own making, and the sun was only getting hotter. Captain Marsh wasted absolutely no time on despair. He had a weapon designed specifically for this exact nightmare, and it was time to deploy it. He bellowed orders from the upper deck, his voice cutting through the panic and confusion. He ordered the crew to rig the grasshopper spars. These were the massive, heavy wooden poles lashed to the bow, the very same peculiar pieces of equipment that had seemed so strange to the uninitiated observers back at the docks. Now, they were the only hope of salvation. The deckhands, fueled by pure adrenaline and the desperate cries of the wounded, sprang into frantic action. They unlashed the massive timbers, wrestling the heavy wood into position over the side of the bow. Thick, heavy hemp ropes were run through complex pulleys and blocks, connecting the top of the spars to the steam-powered winches on the main deck. It was incredibly dangerous, back-breaking work. If a rope snapped under the immense tension, it would whip across the deck with enough force to cut a man completely in half. With the spars angled forward and resting solidly on the muddy riverbed, Marsh gave the signal. The steam winches roared to life, the heavy gears grinding and screaming under the immense, unbelievable strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the thick ropes pulled taut. The massive wooden poles dug deep into the sand, and incredibly, the entire front half of the steamboat began to groan and lift out of the water. The far west was literally standing on its mechanical wooden legs. Once the bow was lifted clear of the gripping mud, the engineers engaged the main engines, thrusting the boat forward. The vessel lurched a few feet ahead, then crashed violently back down into the water as the spars were reset. It was a brutal, jarring process. Lift, push, crash. Lift, push, crash. Every single impact sent shock waves of agony through the wounded soldiers.
but Dr. Porter urged them to hold on, knowing this violent mechanical dance was their only ticket home. If you are captivated by these true stories of historical endurance and want to uncover more incredible moments where humanity was pushed to the absolute brink, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring these forgotten tales back to life. The crew worked like demons in the sweltering morning sun, resetting the heavy poles time and time again, literally walking the massive steamboat over the submerged sandbar, foot by agonizing foot. It took hours of back-breaking, dangerous labor, the men drenched in sweat and covered in river mud. But finally, with one last violent heave, the hull slid off the sand and splashed deeply into the navigable water of the main channel. The far west was free. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted crew, but Marsh didn't celebrate. He instantly rang the bell for full steam ahead. They had lost precious hours, and they had to make up for lost time. The far west finally burst out of the treacherous mouth of the Yellowstone River and swung wide into the massive, sprawling currents of the Missouri River. The change was immediately palpable. The Missouri was significantly wider, deeper, and free from the suffocating, narrow canyons that had made the Yellowstone such a terrifying nightmare to navigate. The immediate danger of submerged snags and hidden sandbars lessened slightly, allowing Captain Marsh to finally open the throttles to their absolute maximum capacity. The great steamboat surged forward, riding the swift, muddy current at speeds that seemed almost airborne. They were making incredible time, covering vast stretches of water in mere hours. But the river was not done testing them. As they raced down the Missouri, the sweltering summer heat began to spawn massive, violent weather systems. Dark, bruised clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling across the open plains with terrifying speed. The wind picked up, howling across the open water, whipping the river into choppy, dangerous whitecaps that slammed against the wooden hull. Furthermore, a new, insidious crisis was quietly unfolding in the sweltering heat of the engine room. The desperate, high-speed run down the Yellowstone, pushing the boilers to their absolute limits, had consumed fuel at a completely unsustainable rate. The massive stockpiles of cordwood they had frantically loaded at the Bighorn encampment were vanishing rapidly into the roaring furnaces. The engineers looked at the dwindling pile of wood with growing horror. They were still hundreds of miles from the safety of Bismarck, and the fuel gauges were dropping just as fast as the barometer. To make matters worse, stopping to cut more wood was absolutely out of the question. The storm was bearing down on them, threatening to batter the fragile wooden vessel to pieces if they didn't keep moving, and the wounded men on the deck were fading faster with every passing hour. Infection was spreading rapidly in the suffocating heat, and Dr. Porter was running entirely out of clean bandages and morphine. The calm before the storm was officially over. Marsh stared at the black clouds churning in the sky ahead, knowing that the final, most brutal test of their endurance was about to begin. They had survived the hidden traps of the Yellowstone. They had survived the darkness, and they had survived the mud. Now they had to survive the fury of the open plains, and they had to do it with an empty fuel tank. The sky turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer against the windows of the pilot house. The wind shrieked through the rigging, tearing at the smokestacks as the far west raced blindly into the teeth of the approaching tempest. The storm didn't just arrive. It attacked the far west with a concussive force that felt like a physical blow. A massive, towering wall of wind and driving rain slammed into the vessel, instantly blinding Captain Marsh in the pilot house. The torrential downpour was so thick and relentless that it completely obscured the banks of the mighty Missouri River, reducing visibility to absolutely zero. The wind howled with a deafening, demonic shriek, tearing at the ornate wooden trim and threatening to rip the tall iron smokestacks right off the roof. The river, which had previously been a smooth highway for their record-breaking run, was whipped into a violent frenzy of churning waves that violently pitched the flat-bottomed boat up and down. Down on the main deck, the situation devolved into pure, unadulterated chaos. The heavy canvas tarpaulins rigged to protect the wounded soldiers were violently ripped away by the gale-force winds, exposing the bleeding men to the freezing, relentless rain. The deckhands scrambled frantically over the slippery, blood-stained planks, desperately trying to secure the remaining cargo and rig makeshift shelters over the shivering, agonizing patients. Dr. Porter worked on his hands and knees in the pooling water, his spectacles fogged and useless, as he desperately tried to keep bandages dry and wounds clean while the boat pitched wildly in the storm. But the most terrifying crisis was unfolding deep in the belly of the ship. The chief engineer climbed the stairs to the pilot house, his face pale and ghostly beneath a thick layer of coal dust and grease. He delivered the news that Marsh had been dreading for the last 100 miles. The fuel was gone. Every single piece of cut cordwood, every scrap of coal, and every piece of combustible material they had loaded at the Bighorn had been completely incinerated in the roaring furnaces. The fireboxes were starving, the massive fires were beginning to die down, and the steam pressure gauges were dropping with terrifying speed. Without steam, the massive paddle wheel would stop turning. Without the paddle wheel, the far west would instantly become a dead, helpless piece of wood at the absolute mercy of the raging storm and the violent river currents. They would be swept into the banks, smashed against the rocks, or capsized by the howling wind. They were agonizingly close to their destination, but they were about to lose all power in the middle of a screaming hurricane. Marsh stared through the rain-streaked glass, the horrifying reality of their situation crashing down upon him. He had pushed his boat, his crew, and himself beyond all known limits of human endurance, only to be defeated by an empty firebox mere hours from salvation. The rhythmic thumping of the engines began to slow, the heartbeat of the far west fading away as the cold, unforgiving storm threatened to swallow them completely. The sudden loss of speed was terrifying. The boat began to drift, the bow swinging wildly as the wind caught the upper decks. The river, sensing, pushed the fragile vessel toward the treacherous, rocky shoreline. Marsh knew he had to feed those starving boilers, and he had to do it right now, regardless of the cost. Captain Grant Marsh made a decision born of absolute, terrifying desperation. If they had no more wood in the cargo hold, they would have to find wood somewhere else. He grabbed the speaking tube and shouted a shocking, unprecedented order down to the frantic engineers and the exhausted deckhands. They were going to burn the boat to save the boat. Marsh ordered his men to grab axes, sledgehammers, and crowbars, and to start tearing the far west apart. The crew didn't hesitate for a single second. Driven by the primal need to survive and the desperate cries of the dying men on the deck, they turned on their own beloved vessel with savage fury. They smashed the ornate wooden railings on the upper decks, splintering the beautifully carved balustrades into jagged, combustible pieces.
They ripped up the heavy wooden floorboards from the passenger cabins, tearing the very deck out from under their own feet. They shattered wooden crates, smashed dining room chairs, and dismantled heavy wooden tables, reducing the luxurious interior of the steamboat to a massive pile of jagged scrap wood. Down in the engine room, the firemen eagerly accepted this bizarre, heartbreaking fuel. They hurled the splintered remnants of the Far West's beautiful architecture straight into the roaring maws of the starving furnaces. The dry painted wood caught fire instantly, burning with incredible, intense heat. The massive iron boilers hissed and roared back to life, the pressure needles jumping violently back into the red zone. The massive pistons pumped with renewed, desperate fury, and the great stern wheel bit hard into the churning water once again. The steamboat surged forward, powered by its own destruction. It was a surreal, almost apocalyptic scene. The Far West was literally cannibalizing herself, shedding her beautiful wooden skin to keep her iron mechanical heart beating. The smoke pouring from the tall chimneys was thick and black, carrying the ashes of the vessel's own decks out into the howling storm. Marsh stood at the wheel, steering a rapidly disintegrating ghost ship through the blinding rain. The boat shuddered and groaned, severely weakened by the structural damage the crew was inflicting upon her, but she refused to die. They fed her walls, her floors, and her furniture, sacrificing the vessel piece by piece to buy the miles they so desperately needed. The storm raged outside, but the fire inside the boilers burned even hotter, fueled by the sheer, unbreakable will of a crew that absolutely refused to let the river win. Every swing of the axe was a prayer, and every splintered plank thrown into the fire was a defiant scream against the odds. The engineers watched the pressure gauges with hawkish intensity, knowing that the dry painted wood burned faster and hotter than normal cordwood, making the risk of a catastrophic boiler explosion even more terrifyingly imminent. But they didn't stop. They kept feeding the beast, pushing the cannibalized vessel faster and faster through the driving rain, racing against the absolute destruction of their own ship. On the night of July 5th, exactly 54 hours after leaving the desolate, bloody banks of the Bighorn River, the battered and splintered Far West finally limped out of the swallowing darkness and into the faint, flickering amber lights of Bismarck, Dakota Territory. The night air was thick with a stagnant, humid heat that seemed to press down on the river, making the atmosphere feel heavy and expectant. The steamboat looked absolutely nothing like the proud, pristine vessel that had steamed upriver just weeks before. She was a horrifying, floating wreck, resembling more of a skeletal sepulcher than a riverboat. Her upper decks were smashed and missing, the fine wooden railings and cabin walls having been chopped to pieces by her own crew to feed the insatiable hunger of the furnaces. Her hull was deeply scarred and gouged by hidden snags, and her once white paint was completely blackened by a thick, greasy layer of soot and caked in dried river mud. She looked like a ghost ship crawling back from the very depths of hell. As the vessel approached the wooden docks of Fort Abraham Lincoln, the loud, desperate shrieking of her steam whistle shattered the quiet night air. The frantic, continuous blast was a jagged, haunting sound that signaled a massive, catastrophic emergency to everyone within miles. The townspeople and the soldiers stationed at the fort rushed down to the riverbank, carrying lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows over the swirling, muddy water. They stood in stunned, absolute silence as the ruined steamboat ground heavily against the wooden pilings,
the timber moaning under the weight of the impact. When the heavy gangplanks were finally lowered, the horrifying reality of what the far west carried was revealed to the world. A thick, cloying smell of old blood, sweat, and gangrene washed over the dock, sickening the assembled crowd and causing many to turn away in revulsion. Army medics rushed aboard, their boots slipping on the blood-soaked canvas tarpaulins as they pushed past the exhausted, soot-covered crew to reach the wounded soldiers. Captain Grant Marsh stepped out of the pilot house with a slow, leaden gait. His hands were stiff, his fingers locked into a permanent, painful curve from gripping the wheel, and his palms were a map of broken blisters and raw flesh. His eyes were completely bloodshot from the relentless glare of the river and the crushing weight of responsibility. He had not slept or eaten a full meal in days, standing at his post through over 2 straight days of unimaginable terror. He watched silently, his jaw set in a hard line, as the 50 wounded men were carefully carried off the boat on stretchers. They were loaded into waiting wagons and rushed up the hill toward the yellow glow of the fort's hospital windows. Dr. Porter, whose uniform was stiff with the dried gore of his comrades, finally collapsed onto a rough wooden crate on the dock. He sat with his head in his hands, his impossible, agonizing mission finally at an end, as the adrenaline drained away, leaving only a hollow ache. The horrific journey was over. They had beaten the treacherous currents, outrun the summer storms, and cheated death itself. The sheer scale of the achievement was almost impossible to comprehend for those watching from the shore. The crowd on the docks whispered in hushed, terrified tones, staring at the shattered wooden remnants of the vessel and the pale, broken bodies of the survivors. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the steamboat's cooling boilers and the soft, exhausted hissing of escaping steam, a mechanical beast finally allowed to rest after a truly impossible marathon. Because of the reckless, iron-willed bravery of Captain Grant Marsh and his exhausted crew, the vast majority of the wounded soldiers pulled from the blood-soaked ashes of the little Bighorn survived. As the men were carried off the deck on stained canvas litters, the sharp, sterile scent of the fort's hospital finally replaced the cloying smell of mud and river water. They received the life-saving surgeries and professional medical care they so desperately needed, an outcome that would have been a physical impossibility had the far west arrived even 12 hours later. But the arrival of the battered, soot-stained steamboat brought more than just broken men. It brought a truth that would rattle the foundations of the entire nation. Before the far west bumped against the Bismarck docks, the American public remained blissfully oblivious to the catastrophe that had claimed the 7th Cavalry. In cities like Philadelphia and New York, citizens were dressed in their finest attire, celebrating the nation's centennial under bright bunting and colorful flags, fully expecting glorious dispatches of a decisive victory on the frontier. Instead, the telegraph operator in Bismarck, his shirt damp with sweat and his eyes stinging from the flickering oil lamp, worked frantically through the night. He tapped out the horrifying message delivered by Marsh, the rhythmic, metallic clicking of the key sounding like a funeral march through the quiet station. The news of Custer's total defeat and the grim reality of the massacre shot across the wires, hitting the East Coast newspapers like a physical blow. The story instantly dominated the front pages, the heavy black ink of the headlines signaling a permanent change in the military campaign and the very history of the American West. Amidst the national shock and mourning,
The incredible feat of the far west was temporarily pushed to the background, but it remained etched in the minds of those who lived by the water. Captain Grant Marsh had steered a massive, top-heavy wooden steamboat 710 miles down a twisting, uncharted, and treacherously shallow river system in exactly 54 hours. His palms were raw and blistered from gripping the wheel, yet he had averaged over 13 miles an hour while navigating through a void of pitch darkness. He had survived bone-jarring groundings and pushed the boilers through a violent, howling storm that threatened to tear the vessel apart. It was a speed record that shattered every previous standard of river travel, and remarkably, it is a record that stands completely unbroken to this day. No commercial vessel, before or since, has ever conquered that specific stretch of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers faster. Marsh didn't perform this miracle for the sake of fame, nor did he seek the heavy purse of a record breaker. He did it because 50 men were groaning in agony on his deck, their lives slipping away in the summer heat, and he absolutely refused to let a single one of them die on his watch. He stood on the bridge as the sun rose, his shoulders slumped with fatigue, but his eyes still fixed on the horizon, knowing he had done the impossible. The legacy of that desperate, high-speed run became a legendary tale, a story whispered with reverence among rivermen for generations to come. The story of the Far West and Captain Grant Marsh is more than just a footnote in the tragic saga of the Little Bighorn. It is a profound, enduring testament to the absolute limits of human endurance and the incredible depths of human compassion. When faced with an impossible situation, surrounded by death and staring down the barrel of a completely unforgiving wilderness, Marsh and his crew did not surrender to despair. They didn't accept the inevitable. Instead, they pushed themselves and their remarkable machine far beyond the boundaries of what anyone believed was physically possible. They broke all the rules of the river. They risked their own lives time and time again, and they literally tore their own beloved ship apart, all for the singular purpose of saving the lives of strangers. It reminds us that even in the darkest, most violent chapters of our history, when humanity seems entirely lost to brutality and war, there are still moments of blinding, incredible light. There are still people willing to step into the darkness, to shoulder impossible burdens, and to drive forward against all odds to protect the fragile flame of human life. The battered, blackened hull of the Far West represents the very best of what we are capable of when we refuse to give up. The records they set were measured in hours and miles, but the true weight of their achievement is measured in the generations of families that exist today, simply because those wounded soldiers made it home. If you were moved by this incredible story of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit, please hit that subscribe button. We are dedicated to bringing you more deep dives into the forgotten, awe-inspiring moments of history that prove just how resilient humanity can truly be. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next documentary. History is often written by the victors, or focused entirely on the grand tragedies, leaving these quiet, desperate moments of heroism buried in the dust. But it is exactly these stories, the tales of ordinary people doing absolutely extraordinary things in the face of certain doom, that deserve to be remembered and celebrated for the rest of time.